Why does it seem like single-aisle aircraft are getting bigger and bigger for every new generation? And why are long-haul aircraft going in the other direction? In some of my previous videos, I've talked about the advent of revolutionary new technologies like hydrogen, new airframe designs, and new awesome engines like the CFM RISE. As these new technologies are on their way in, they are forcing aviation to adapt to a new reality, and we're already seeing some of that playing out. The question is, what comes next? Stay tuned. I'm sure you have already noticed that some of the more popular aircraft designs out there, particularly the single-aisle ones, seems to be getting longer and longer every time that they're updated, and the Boeing 737 family is probably the most obvious example of that. In the original 737 generation, the one we pilots often refer to as the Jurassics, the 737 could typically fit around 130 people inside the cabin. Then came the 737-400, which was the most popular variant of the classic generation, and it could squeeze in around 170 people. After the classics came the next generation family, which I normally fly, and in the most popular sub-variant of that generation, the 737-800, Boeing managed to squeeze in 189 passengers. The latest iteration of the 737 family is of course the Maxes, which mostly mirrors the 737NG in capacity, except that it also includes the Max 10, which can fit as many as 230 passengers inside of it. This means that the latest, biggest version of the 737 can fit 100 more passengers than the first one could. But the 737 isn't the only example of this type of growth happening within the single-aisle aircraft. The Airbus A320 family hasn't grown beyond the originally planned A321, well, at least not yet. But the first generation of the A320, which supported 186 or even fewer seats, used to be the most popular model among the airlines, selling around twice as well as the larger legacy A321 did. But now something has definitely changed, because the A321neo is now easily outselling both the A319 and the A320neo combined. And by the way, even though it has the same cabin length as the old model, Airbus has recently reconfigured the A321neo to fit as many as 240 seats instead of the original 230. This market shift away from the A320 and towards the A321neo shows a substantial capacity growth appetite among the airlines. And if we look at the smaller Airbus A319, well, it's hardly getting any sales at all, and Airbus didn't even bother to make a neo version of the smallest variant, the A318 baby bus. Now, it should be mentioned that this gradual aircraft growth tendency isn't really a new thing. We also saw that happening in older designs like the DC-9, which evolved into the MD-80 family and then finally into the Boeing 717. And at the bigger end of the single-aisle scale, Boeing introduced the 757-200 in the early 1980s, and then they followed it up with the much longer flying pencil 757-300 around 2 decades later. Now, you will be excused for thinking that whatever is causing this gradual enlargement of the single-aisle aircraft would also start to affect the larger twin-aisle jets. But no. It hasn't. If anything, for the past 2 or 3 decades at least, it seems to actually go in the opposite way. I have done a lot of videos about why the 747 Queen of the Skies and the giant Airbus A380 have been both discontinued, and this flight away from the super jumbos seems to be, at least for now, continuing. The 747s haven't been used by any main US carriers for many years by now, and no US airline ever have ordered a single Airbus A380. But it should be mentioned here that Boeing did enlarge the 777 into the 777X, but they did that primarily to replace the even bigger 747, so that's actually a move away from big to small and not the other way around. Now, one huge reason for this shift away from the larger to the smaller widebodies involves the airline's shift from the hub and spoke to the point-to-point operating model. That's also something that I've discussed in some previous videos, but as the name implies, an airline using the hub and spoke model relies on one or possibly a few big hub airports, which they then can connect with smaller satellite airports to move their passengers around. Qatar Airways and Emirates are great examples of airlines who are still using this model, but they are getting fewer and fewer in numbers. With the hub and spoke model, since the big hubs will only have a limited number of runways, they can also only allow a limited number of takeoffs and landings every day, so big aircraft is a must in order to increase passenger capacity. On the other hand, the point-to-point model is a bit more, well, dynamic. Again, as the name suggests, this is a model where smaller airports, even geographically far from each other, are connected directly by the airlines without having to move through any hub. This means that the aircraft movements can be spread out, and therefore smaller, more economical twin-engine aircraft can be used at higher frequencies. There are obviously more variations and factors to consider in these models depending on the kind of network that each airline has, but generally speaking, over time the airlines who haven't got a geographically excellent hub as their home base have been shifting more and more towards the point-to-point model. So why is that then, and what has that got to do with the single aisles getting bigger? Well, one big reason is that passengers actually prefer this model. It generally means fewer or even no connecting flights, and for the airline, this model can have some financial benefits in terms of aircraft efficiency and also by avoiding the often humongous landing and handling fees at the big hubs. But to make the point-to-point model work properly, the industry needed to make a few changes, particularly in the aircraft design. Basically, instead of flying long distances with huge jets like the A380 or the 747, they now needed smaller widebodies like the Boeing 787 and the Airbus A350 to do basically the same thing. With Airbus introducing the A321XLR, we can now also expect to see some single-aisle jets operating these extreme long-haul routes, and everyone can have their own opinion about whether or not that is a good thing or not. I'll leave that up to you guys. So that explains why bigger, long-haul aircraft are getting smaller. But why are short and medium-haul aircraft getting bigger and bigger then? And how much bigger can these single-aisle aircraft actually get? Well, I'll tell you the answer to both of those questions after this. As I'm sure you know, it can be really hard to find the best deals on flights, car rental and hotels nowadays. But there are actually some hacks out there, and to show you one, let me introduce you to today's sponsor, NordVPN. Nord is a travel companion that not only helps you to keep your data safe and secure, but can also help to save real money on your bookings. And how do they do that? Well, airlines use something called dynamic pricing, which is basically a way to optimize their profits based on which location, time, demand and date that you want to travel. One big part of that strategy is utilizing the currency you will be booking into, making sure that the exchange rate falls in the favor of the airline and not to you. But if you start by clearing your cookies and then fire up NordVPN and virtually move to different countries, you can try to book flights from there instead. Try, for example, your destination or maybe the airline's home country and see what difference it makes. You'll be very surprised sometimes. I personally also use Nord whenever I am traveling nowadays to access my favorite programs or when I want to watch hockey from home in Spain. It's awesome. You can check this out by going to the link below, which is nordvpn.com/mentornow. This will give you a special deal with free month whenever you sign up for a 2-year deal. Remember, you're not risking anything because Nord always have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Now, let's continue. It turns out that there are actually a number of reasons why aircraft used in short and medium-haul flights have been growing over time. Perhaps the most obvious reason is the ever-growing demand for this type of travel, and that's also what's driving the now looming pilot shortage. In fact, they are kind of connected, which I'll explain soon. But there is also a practical and perhaps a little bit less obvious reason why manufacturers are now making our planes longer and longer, and that's just pure technological progress. As time goes by, technological advances have meant that increasing aircraft size and weight have gone from being impossible to actually becoming possible for already existing designs like the 737 and the Airbus A320. The first and probably the biggest reason for this becoming possible is the progress in engine technology. The two Pratt & Whitney JT8 Deltas fitted to the early versions of the 737-200 had literally half of the thrust output that the CFM LEAP 1 Bravos have, which the 737 MAX uses. And obviously, if you can now hang engines with much more thrust available under the wings, it would be really wasteful to not try to also squeeze in more passengers inside of the cabin. The existing engine designs out there are actually also getting incrementally better as time goes by because of more data that the engineers can harvest from the engines as they're being used en route, and they can use that data to optimize and tweak them to become better. Other technological advancements that has made this aircraft growth possible involve improvements in aerodynamic knowledge, which has created better wings and better high lift devices like flaps and slats who can help existing wings to cope with lifting more weight. And from an airline's perspective, carrying more passengers in an aircraft of the same footprint is obviously a great thing from a cost perspective. If you think about it, for a given number of passengers, using bigger jets will mean that an airline will need to pay, or even to find, fewer crews, and since the engines are getting more efficient, they will also have to pay less fuel per passenger. On top of that, it also means that the airline would need fewer airport slots, which can become pretty important, especially if they're operating into really busy airports. So if the airlines want this growth to continue, then the next question obviously becomes, is there an upper limit to this? How big can these single-aisle aircraft actually get? Well, other than some variants of the old Douglas DC-8, the longest single-aisle aircraft ever made is the 757-300, which is 54.4 meters or just over 178 feet long. Now, to be honest, that's already a bit too long for a number of reasons. First of all, with that length and size, the wingspan needs to be so wide that the 757 can't operate from the smaller and cheaper gates that the 737 and A320 can. You typically can't be wider than 36 meters for that. This also means that the airlines operating the 757 will have to pay higher handling fees when they're doing so. And the second thing, have you ever been on a flight where everyone seems to wait until they reach their own row before they start removing their backpacks and jackets while everyone else behind them is waiting? Well, that's kind of the curse of a single-aisle aircraft, and it's bad enough on a 737-800 with 189 seats. But remember, the 757-300 had 275 or even as many as 280 seats, so you can do the maths there. Boarding and deboarding times with these type of large single-aisle aircraft can actually be a bit of a nightmare, and quick turnaround times is really important for keeping the efficiency high in short and medium haul operations. Remember, the aircraft is only making money whilst it's in the air. Keeping this in mind, it's maybe not surprising that Boeing only made 55 of these super long 757-300s, as opposed to over 900 of the shorter 757-200, not including the freighters. So this means that if Airbus or Boeing wants to introduce a new aircraft for short to medium haul, and that aircraft needs to be bigger than the 737 MAX 10 or the A321neo, well, then they'll have to make its cabin wider, not longer. Now, the idea of using twin-aisle aircraft for short haul is not exactly new. In the 1980s, Boeing was working on a project called the 7J7, which was going to be the replacement for the 727 and possibly even the 737. The most notable thing of that aircraft design was probably the use of open-fan engines, whose history and possible future I've talked about before here on the channel. But another really interesting feature of the 7J7 was that it was actually a wide-body cabin. It went through a few different design iterations, but in the end it had a fuselage width of 188 inches or 4.78 meters. As John Ostrower explains in the excellent Air Current, this width would have made the 7J7 only about 10 inches or 25 centimeters narrower than a 767, but with the same 232 economy seat layout. Boeing studied different layouts extensively, looking at how width and the number of aisles affected the boarding and deboarding times, but ultimately the 7J7 was shelved for a couple of different reasons, which likely deserves its own video. But if Boeing wants to launch an aircraft today using a similar cross-section as the 7J7 had, well, then they would quickly run into some really serious problems. Remember, what I'm talking about here is the prospect of a new twin-aisle aircraft, which would be made to replace the single-aisle 737 family. That would mean that this hypothetical twin-aisle aircraft would need to be as efficient, or probably even more efficient, than the current 737 MAXes are, because otherwise, what's really the point? And the problem with that, when it comes to design with a large enough diameter to be a twin-aisle, is that it will likely produce just too much drag for that to happen. Or would it? What if such an aircraft was designed with a fuselage that had an elliptical cross-section instead of a round one, so that it would be much wider than it would be tall? Now, many aircraft fuselages aren't completely round, but the problem with having a fuselage with a pronounced elliptical cross-section is the potential for excess metal fatigue due to the bending moments of the structure that occurs when it goes through the pressurization and depressurization cycles. The 7J7 would have had a round cylindrical fuselage, and it would have made use of a clever new aluminium lithium alloy. The plans also included cool features like a modern cockpit, possibly with fly-by-wire and side sticks, but that's a different story. Now, all of this was very impressive, especially considering that the 7J7 was being designed already back in the 1980s. Now, that type of aluminium lithium alloy that they were planning to use are actually used today in the fuselage of the Airbus A220, and Boeing is also finally introducing them for the first time, at least at large scale, with the Boeing 777X. But while it has some great properties, aluminium lithium is still a metal alloy, prone to fatigue, so they couldn't really use that if they wanted to make a true elliptical fuselage. But if someone like Boeing was actually really looking at the prospect of building a twin-aisle short and medium-haul airline today, well, then they would probably be looking at making it out of composites, which is much less prone to fatigue and could definitely be used for a more creative fuselage shape. This is a topic that Scott Hamilton and Björn Färm have explored extensively inside of Lihem News, which, by the way, I wholeheartedly recommend that you check out if you're into very detailed aviation topics. They are truly awesome. The reason Lihem News have been looking at these ideas is because for some time now it seems like Boeing has actually been studying alternative concepts for their future aircraft. And that's not just for their new mid-sized airplane, or NMA, which was expected to replace the 757 and 767. And if they are looking at that, they might actually be looking at something as unconventional as this. Boeing's CEO, Dave Calhoun, has actually said that the company isn't really interested in simply developing a niche aircraft to compete solely with the Airbus A321XLR. No, when Boeing finally launches a new aircraft, he says that it will be far wider reaching than that. But remember, their plans for the new mid-sized airplane was also a twin-aisle aircraft, so there is some opportunity here to come up with a new multi-role design that could possibly be used for both short, medium and long-haul flights. Now, Björn Färm is currently running through a really detailed series of articles about the way different fuselage shapes and other design factors affect different kinds of drag. In this series, he also explains other considerations for the fuselage shape and the cross-section, like, for example, the amount of cargo and the size of cargo containers that elliptical or round fuselages will allow, which is obviously very important economical aspects for any future design. And when we're on the subject of containers, another future development that could possibly also favor larger diameter fuselages, even for short and medium-haul aircraft, is hydrogen propulsion. As most of you know, hydrogen contains a lot of energy by weight, but it only has a fraction of the density of other fuels. That means that an aircraft using hydrogen, either as a fuel cell or as fuel for the jet engines, would need a lot of volume to store it. There are also a lot more factors to consider here. For example, the possible need for folding wings for a twin-aisle aircraft to fit into the same gates as the 737s and the Airbus A320s do. Boeing certainly have a lot of possible design choices to make if they choose to go down the wide-body route. Now, I've talked a lot about Boeing so far, and that's obviously because everyone is trying to guess what their coming plans are, but what about Airbus? Well, as I've explained before, their superior financial position means that they should be able to follow or even leapfrog Boeing in developing an all-new aircraft design if they choose to do so. But interestingly here, Airbus may already have something up their sleeve as an intermediate solution to counter a wide-body Boeing contender. and that's the Airbus A330neo. You see, when Airbus still believed that 4-engine jets would rule supreme for long haul, they first made the A340 to fit that role, and then they created the A330 for shorter distances. The A340 never did very well commercially, but in some parts of Asia, the A330 has actually been in use for many years on medium-haul flights, lasting around 3 to 4 hours. And now Airbus is actively pursuing this role for the new A330neo by reinforcing its landing gear and generally adapting it to better handle the demands of frequent cycles. Of course, the A330 can still fly long haul if needed, but in most cases the newer A350 is now a much better fit for that role. However, for medium haul, the A330neo would only be a temporary solution, and it would only suit some airlines since it's just too big to fit in the kind of gates airlines normally use for short and medium haul. But in some really busy airports with few available slots, it certainly might be a great interim solution. Finally, if we're looking into the future, there's also a possibility that the complexity of the infrastructure needed for future hydrogen fuel will again concentrate the flights around a smaller number of airports. If this is the case, this movement towards wide-body feeder aircraft might have to be accelerated, as hydrogen is only likely to be able to be used for short and medium-haul operations, at least in the beginning. Long-haul aircraft will continue to use fossil fuel or SAF for the foreseeable future, but this new and hopefully greener aviation future might well be the catalyst for these short to medium-haul wide bodies to finally become a viable reality. What do you think? I would love to hear your opinions in the comment section below. Now, check out any of these videos next and consider buying a t-shirt if you want to support the channel. If you want to do live hangouts with me and become part of my real inner circle, well then join my fabulous Patreon crew. If you join above the $10 per month tier, you will also get premium access to both my apps. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.